so much for inviting me. Thanks, Fabrizio, and thanks, Marco. It's a great pleasure being here. As Marco said, I saw the series of neural mechanism seminars, like, sort of like starting, being born, and now it's pretty much successful and walking on its own feet very successfully. So it's a great pleasure being here. Um, Thanks sort of for the opportunity to present this paper that I recently finished and will appear in a special issue for the Journal of Consciousness Studies. This is not an easy paper, probably, if there's any easy paper in the history of philosophy, because trying to talk about IIT, meaning a scientific theory, and resilient monism, which is more like a metaphysical view, it's very hard. It's hard because one has to introduce both, and there are a lot of details in both views that are pretty obscure. So I'll do my best, and I hope you will follow me. If not, please let me know in the question time. So the general idea of this talk is to try to focus on reflection on theories of consciousness. And very simplistically, I think one could phrase the state of the art in this way. If we were to set, sort of to locate the theories of consciousness on two axes as they are present right now in the debate, we have some theories that are trying to deal with the scientific aspects of consciousness, meaning awareness. Some people call it access consciousness, since blocks distinction, and they also focus on report. So these theories, such as global neural workspace or higher order theories or predictive coding, all share the attention for this aspect of consciousness, which is mainly access consciousness, as I mentioned, and are, of course, philosophical theories, but they arguably try to avoid talking directly of a different aspect of consciousness that in the philosophical debate has been the focus of a different kind of debate. And this aspect of consciousness is the one related to the phenomenal, qualitative, subjective aspect of experience. The one that, of course, people have been referring to as Qualia, or what is it like to be a specific conscious being. There are, of course, some theories in the debate that are, let's say, purely philosophical, like resilient monism, which was proposed by Chalmers initially, and recently has been the focus of a big debate in metaphysics and philosophy of mind. But these theories are, like resilient monism, being sort of purely metaphysical, are silent about the neuroscientific aspects, the numeric correlates of consciousness, and to most people, they don't look as satisfactory precisely because they don't allow for a science of consciousness to be developed. So the idea that is there, integrated information theory at least argues to do both at the same time. It's trying to be a scientific theory of consciousness and at the same time to deal with the philosophical aspects, meaning phenomenal consciousness. And to what extent it succeeds, well, that's an open question. But in this talk, I will mainly focus on the philosophical aspects of IIT and resilient monism, and I will try to tackle the question whether they deal in a different way with some problems that in the metaphysics and philosophy of mind have been, again, the center of a very big debate related to the hard problem of consciousness. So these problems have been phrased in many, many different ways, and there's two main philosophical challenges that I would like to focus on. So first of all, a general formulation of the R problem, which is, let's say, sort of the core of the issue for philosophers and for some scientists as well, is to provide an answer to the following question. Why is it the case that some physical states or some neural processes or some functions, what have you, which I, for the length of this talk, will refer to as P, are accompanied by phenomenal experience, which I will indicate as Q. And Y, also, this should happen as a matter of metaphysical necessity. This formulation of the R problem is, of course, debatable. There's many formulations, and this is sort of my favorite one because it really highlights the problems that physicalism has in trying to deal with the metaphysical aspects of consciousness, meaning trying to explain what's the relation between the physical and the experiential properties, and why this connection should be a matter of metaphysical necessity. So any theory that identifies consciousness with something else, meaning claims that there is an identity between consciousness and some other properties, will have to deal with the fact that identity entails metaphysical necessity. And in order to point out what are the challenges that one has to face when proposing a solution to the hard problem formulated in this way, two scenarios have been used very widely. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people are very familiar with these, but I'll just go through them slowly so that we don't leave anything out. So the first scenario is the one that has been called like absent qualia, or to a certain extent we can also refer to the conceivability argument for philosophical zombies as claiming basically exactly the same thing, reaching the same conclusion. The idea is that if the physical properties can be instantiated in the absence of phenomenal properties, so if this situation is metaphysically possible, then phenomenal properties cannot be identical to physical properties. And this is, of course, a challenge for physicalism, because physicalism precisely claims that phenomenal properties are identical to physical properties. There is also a second scenario which doesn't involve the absence of qualia, but an inversion of qualia, so inversion of spectrum, or dancing qualia, meaning qualia that go back and forth between being one experience and another experience, but being instantiated always in connection with the same physical properties. So the inverted qualia scenario is usually expressed in the following form. If it is possible, it is metaphysically possible that the same physical property is instantiated simultaneously with different experiential properties, then phenomenal properties cannot be identical to physical properties. So if there can be an experience of red and an experience of green that are instantiated and metaphysically connected to the very same physical properties being instantiated, then so the line of this talk would be, I will ask the question, how do integrated information theory and Russellian monism fare with respect to absent and inverted qualia scenarios, and how do they explain a little bit more in detail what is the content of experience that that phenomenal properties are supposed to pick out. So, sorry. In the first part, I will just start by a quick introduction of Russellian monism, and I will focus on the metaphysical foundation of one version of Russellian monism, which is the most popular one, which is categoricalism. And then I will try to sort of test and show how does Russellian monism reply to the absent qualia and inverted qualia arguments. Then I will do the same with IIT. I will claim that IIT is best understood as compatible with pandispositionalism, which is an alternative metaphysical view to categoricalism, and then I will show how IIT fares with comparison to the absent qualia and inverted qualia scenarios. So the conclusion, not to spoil the best part, but so that you know where I'm going, is that Russellian monism, I think, excludes absent qualia scenarios, but not inverted qualia scenarios, due to its commitment to categoricalism. And on top of that, it is pretty much silent about the content of experience. So there's no explanation of the content of experience. Whereas IIT, I claim, excludes both, at least in principle. So this is precisely because of its metaphysical foundations and also its commitment to pandispositionalism. I think it also may provide an account of the content of experience based on its specific assumptions about the connection between phenomenal properties and some other kind of properties, meaning cause-effect power, but I will go into the details of that. So first of all, what is Russellian monism? Well, Russellian monism is basically a variation on a view that Russell himself defended at a certain point. Then he changed his mind, but at a certain point, most people quote this passage from Russell, where he said, physics in itself is extremely abstract and reveals only certain mathematical characteristics of the material with which it deals. It does not tell us anything as to the intrinsic character of this material. But also Russell said that percepts are the only part of the physical world that we know otherwise than abstractly, meaning we know our experience directly, whereas like we know the physical world only indirectly, only extrinsically. So one possible explanation of the metaphysics of reality that Russellian monists are trying to push is that intrinsically all reality is phenomenal, because phenomenal properties are the only intrinsic properties that we have, whereas like the rest of physical reality is merely an extrinsic part of reality. And this is for different reasons. So the first reason is that Russellian monism endorses a metaphysics of properties that is very specific in the distinction between the physical and the phenomenal. And here I'm talking about this particular version of Russellian monism, which is the main one that is has been proposed by Chalmers and Alter and Nagasawa. And I know that there's variations on this issue, but I honestly think that, first of all, the Russellian monist version that assumes categoricalism, which is the most popular, should be analyzed in terms of its connection to the metaphysics, to the neuroscientific theories of consciousness and its implications. So that's why I'm focusing on this in this paper. So Russellian monism in this version basically claims that physical properties are only dispositional, meaning structural, extrinsic, relational, etc. They mostly conflate all these different notions, whereas phenomenal properties are the only categorical properties that we know, meaning they are non-structural, they are intrinsic, and they are non-relational. But also Russellian monism claims that all dispositional properties need to be grounded in categorical analysis. So phenomenal properties are the only categorical properties that we know about, that we can know intrinsically. The conclusion is that physical dispositions need to be grounded in physical properties. And this is precisely what Russellian monism concludes. So the commitment to categoricalism, I claim, is crucial, even though often it is not considered as a central core of Russellian monism, precisely because a lot of things follows from this. So just a couple of quotations to show what I've just said. Alter and Nagasawa claim that phenomenal properties constitute the categorical basis for fundamental physical dispositions, and Chalmers claims that quiddities, which are again the essences of properties, are the fundamental categorical properties that play fundamental roles specified in physics. So they are the categorical base of the micro-physical dispositions. And, So Russellian monism can be summarized as the conjunction of the following three claims, and this is Alter and Nagasawa formulation. So first of all, it assumes structuralism about physics. It says that physics describes reality's basic properties only in structural and dispositional terms, in line with Russell. The second claim is realism about inscrutables. So inscrutables are precisely the quiddities that Chalmers was talking about. So categorical properties that ground these physical structural and relational properties. And the third claim is that the inscrutables, meaning the quiddities, meaning the categorical bases of physical dispositions, are phenomenal. So all dispositional properties need to be grounded in a categorical basis, and the only categorical basis we know is phenomenal properties. So that's the version of Russellian monism I have in mind. A couple of precisifications about categoricalism and its connection with panpsychism, because Russellian monism has been, of course, casted in panpsychist terms, and maybe its most popular version is this categoricalist panpsychist version of Russellian monism. Is that, first of all, categorical properties are often defined as actual manifest qualities with no essential dispositional character, causal or nomic role, and applied to phenomenal properties. This definition of categoricalism says that phenomenal properties are actual manifest qualities with no essential dispositional character, causal or nomic role. So qualia are these kind of properties. And another implication of Russellian monism is that every entity that exists in reality is either conscious or it is composed of conscious entities. So we have in the ontology, sort of the list of things that exist in reality, we have microphysical entities and properties that have micro experience or are grounded in intrinsic categorical microphenomenal properties, and we have macro physical entities or macrophysical properties that are either composed of micro-conscious entities, so for example, rocks that are not conscious by themselves, but they are composed of little bits of consciousness, or things that have experience in themselves or are grounded in intrinsic categorical macrophenomenal properties, such as brains or human beings or arguably animals. So the idea is that we have this distinction between the micro and the macro level. So if this is the formulation of Russellian monism we have in mind, we can ask the question, how does Russellian monism fare with respect to the first philosophical challenge that I introduced at the beginning, which is the one of absent qualia. So the most famous formulation of the absent qualia scenario, which is also the formulation of the conceivability argument for philosophical zombies, is the following. If physical property, if it is conceivable that physical properties are instantiated in the absence of phenomenal properties, remember that P is physical and Q is phenomenal, meaning qualia. If P and not Q is conceivable, then P and not Q is metaphysically possible. And of course, this is a very debatable step. Chalmers has a defense of the fact that conceivability entails possibility. I will not enter into the issues on this specific point. I will just try to accept with the benefit of the doubt that the argument is sound. So if P and not Q is conceivable, then P and not Q is metaphysically possible, and if P and not Q is metaphysically possible, then physical properties cannot be identical to phenomenal properties. And so the conclusion is precisely that P cannot be identical to Q. So let's imagine the following scenario in which we have A, which is a conscious human being with a brain, and this brain has, as you can see, qualia that are instantiated simultaneously with the physical properties going on in that brain. And then we ask the question, is it possible that we duplicate only the physical properties without duplicating at the same time the phenomenal properties? And so we create a sort of zombie A, a zombie duplicate of A. So since for Russellian monism, the phenomenal properties play no causal or nomic role, one could say, well, it should be possible to duplicate the physical properties without duplicating the phenomenal properties, because all we need is to duplicate simply the dispositions, the physical dispositions, and the absence of phenomenal properties is perfectly conceivable. So there will be no difference in the observed behavior for the zombie copy. So it doesn't look like metaphysically impossible to simply duplicate the physical properties without the phenomenal properties. But for Arcelian monism, this is actually not the case, because the reply, based on the metaphysics that I just introduced, is that if the physical properties, if the picture is actually inverted, it's like upside down, if the physical properties, as Arcelian monism claims, are grounded in the phenomenal properties, then it's actually impossible to duplicate only the physical properties without necessarily duplicating the phenomenal properties, which are their categorical basis. So there can exist no instantiation of a physical properties that is not grounded in a phenomenal property. So the idea for Arcelian monism is that turning the picture, seeing consciousness as fundamental, as an intrinsic aspect of reality, the zombie scenario or the absent qualia scenario are excluded a priori. So this sounds like an interesting way to deal with this situation, and pretty successful. Now let's see what happens when we try to see how Arcelian monism deals with the inverted qualia scenario. So very similarly to the previous argument, we can phrase this as a conceivability argument. We can say, if one specific physical property P1 if it is conceivable that a property P1 can be instantiated in association with a different any number of phenomenal properties Qn, if it is conceivable, then it should be metaphysically possible that a physical property can be instantiated in association with different phenomenal properties. And if this is the case, then phenomenal properties cannot be identical to physical properties. And this is explained, this is shown by the situation in which we have a conscious human being, again, our A1, where the phenomenal properties are, one phenomenal properties, let's say the experience of red, is grounded in the physical property, a state of the brain, that specific situation. And then we ask the question, is it conceivable and is it metaphysically possible that we keep the physical properties identical, but we switch the phenomenal properties, meaning Q2, which is an experience, for example, of green, is instantiated in association with the same physical property in subject A2. And the little arrows inside A2's brain are supposed to represent the inversion of qualia, because the colors are switched. So again, if the phenomenal properties play no causal role, it should be possible to fix the physical properties without fixing the phenomenal properties. And what is the reply of Arcelian monism to this scenario? Well, it is true that physical properties need to be grounded in phenomenal properties, but precisely which physical property must be grounded in which phenomenal property is left completely unexplained or implicit in the Arcelian monist view. So the idea is that we could duplicate the physical properties, and the only thing that we know is that A2, subject A2, will have some sort of experience, but claiming that it will be exactly the same experience it doesn't follow necessarily from the premises of Arcelian monism. And on top of that, even just starting from the instantiation of one specific physical property, asking the question, which is the phenomenal property that grounds this physical property, is a question to which Arcelian monism doesn't have an answer. So the situation seems to be that Arcelian monism is able to exclude zombie and absent qualia scenarios, but is not very well equipped to deal with inverted qualia scenarios. There are, of course, for Russellian monism, some ways out. The first one is just to claim that the connection between physical properties and phenomenal properties is a brute fact. So it is a brute fact that, as a matter of metaphysical necessities, P, so physical properties of the type A, actually the type alpha, are grounded in phenomenal properties of the type alpha and not of the type beta, for example. So it is necessary that if P alpha is grounded in Q alpha, then it is not grounded in Q beta, something like that. However, the brute fact strategy arguably is non-explanatory simply because it basically assumes that it is brute fact, and it is also uninformative because how could we actually know which phenomenal properties ground which physical properties? The only thing that we know is an association with our own experience. But if we were able to detect that the physical properties instantiated, we wouldn't be able to deduce any phenomena, to infer any phenomenal properties that would be associated with them. So the second strategy is to avoid brute fact and, for example, claim that there is still a metaphysical necessary connection between the two, but for slightly different reasons. So we could say, for example, that phenomenal properties of the type alpha necessarily ground physical properties of the type alpha because they are necessarily connected to the powers that the physical properties of type alpha bring about. Now, the question is that based on the definition of categorical properties that we gave before, it sounds that we could actually read this statement as saying that phenomenal properties of type alpha are essentially disposed towards the powers of physical properties of type alpha. And as, for example, Barbara Montero claimed, we could raise the objection that if categorical is supposed to imply not dispositional, it is unclear whether there are any categorical properties, just in case phenomenal properties are essentially disposed towards grounding physical properties. And then the third the second horn, or the second strategy, is to appeal to laws of nature, in which basically necessary metaphysical connection between categorical bases and dispositions is just due to laws of nature. The problem with this strategy is that, according to proposers of theories of laws of nature like Armstrong and Bird and Lewis, laws of nature are only contingent relation among categorical properties. So there would be still no metaphysical necessity. And of course, these strategies seem to have no parsimony. Okay, so if Russellian monism is in this sort of bad situation, let's see what we can do with integrated information theory and how it fares in these scenarios. So first of all, I will refer to a version of Iit that is probably more updated than the ones that are currently in press, because I'm basing what I'm saying mostly on the last paper by Tononi and colleagues, the two chapters of by Tononi in the new edition of the Blackwell Companion to Consciousness, which are probably the most updated ones, and a couple of papers that are actually forthcoming. So please bear with me, and if you are skeptical, ask me in the question time. So this is a non-canonical presentation of Iit. I will skip a lot of details. I will just go to the core claims that are relevant for my purpose here. So first of all, let me clarify what is Iit's methodology. Iit starts from what it's sometimes called phenomenology first approach, in which thanks to introspection about our own consciousness, we can come up with some axioms, some essential properties of experience that seem necessary and jointly sufficient for every state of consciousness. And this is, Iit labels them axioms precisely because they're supposed to be essential properties that characterize all experience. Then the question that we can ask based on the axioms is, what properties should a physical system have to instantiate the properties that are singled out by the axiom, so the properties that we find necessary and sufficient for experience. And Iits calls this the postulates, meaning properties of a physical substrate of consciousness that should correspond to the axioms. So the picture here is, imagine there is a conscious guy, and the conscious guy observes some regularities in its experience. And these regularities in experience for Iits, which are up to this point only phenomenal properties, ground the inference that there probably is an external world made of physical stuff and cause-effect power that justify all of these regularities in experience. And in this external world, there is a very special object, which is the brain, that looks like it is very deeply connected to our own experience, because there is sort of connection, correlation between the states of this specific piece of the physical world and our own experience. And the postulates apply precisely to the physical substrate of consciousness, meaning that some properties of the brain seem to correspond to the properties that our phenomenology has, and the properties that look essential to it. So this is the methodology of Iits. Now, what do we say about the actual experience? What is Iits' explanation of account of the experience, and how is it connected to this sort of inference to the existence of an external world? So there are 5 axioms. I will just focus on the first axiom and on the first postulate here. So for Iits, the starting point is really a sort of Cartesian cogito argument for which consciousness exists. It is real. It is maybe the only real thing that we actually experience. And it is also intrinsic. It exists in and for itself. It is always my consciousness. It is always from my intrinsic subjective perspective. And what we can do is we can introspect our own experience, and we can sort of map the phenomenal properties, the qualia, the phenomenal distinctions, and create some sort of mapping of this. What we can do, we can also, translating the axiom number 1 into the postulate number 1, we can say that the physical subject of consciousness must exist. There must be something in the external world that justifies this experience, that grounds this experience, not in a metaphysical sense, that simply corresponds to this, since we find independent reason to think that there is an external world in the first place. And the idea for Iits is that in order to exist, it must also have causal powers upon something. It must, Iits says, exist intrinsically. It must have causal power upon itself, so constrain its own states. So the idea is that with Iits, we can take the physical substrate and try to study, to map the causal powers of the physical substrate in terms of the cause-effect, what Iits calls concepts, the cause-effect repertoires that specific mechanisms have, and the causal constraint that each individual part of a system of mechanism has upon all the rest of the system. And the set of all the concepts that are precisely this sort of cause-effect powers, the cause-effect repertoire of each individual mechanism, is the mapping that describes fully the cause-effect structure of a system, in this case, our brain. And Iits says it is the set of maximally reducible cause-effect powers possessed by an intrinsically existing mechanism. So for Iits, the hypothesis, the claim, the ambitious proposal is that if it turns out that starting from phenomenology and inferring the existence of the external world and studying the cause-effect power of the brain with the essential properties of experience that we derive from our introspection in mind, we can find something like an isomorphism between properties of a cause-effect structure and properties of experience, precisely because these two things, so the cause-effect structure is supposed to translate the essential properties of consciousness. And based on this isomorphism, we can also grant some inferences. So IIT has been described in very different ways with some esoteric and cryptic language, unfortunately, and sometimes also quite misleading terms. So one big issue is that in many papers, the isomorphism between cause-effect structures and phenomenal experience is based on what the authors call a central identity for IIT, meaning the idea that a maximally reducible conceptual structure is generated by a complex of elements and it is identical to the experience. So this definition of identity is kind of an odd one. Talking with Giulio Tononi many times and many other people here at the lab, it's getting clear what the meaning of this central identity is, and for philosophers maybe it's not an appropriate term. The idea is that this identity is supposed to be an explanatory identity rather than a metaphysical identity. So we can start from the realization that physical properties, meaning cause-effect power, are merely postulated from within experience and are a translation of the axioms about phenomenal experience. And IIT's postulates provide us with a theoretical object, which is a cause-effect structure, which properties are supposed to correspond one-to-one to the properties of experience. So they are identical in a way, so a cause-effect structure and our, let's say, structure of the qualia space of experience are identical in the sense that there is a one-to-one correspondence within properties of one and properties of the other, and this can be used to infer back in a sort of inferential virtuous circle properties of phenomenal experience, validate the theory, of course, and make inferences about some situations that are otherwise inaccessible, like disorder of consciousness patients, other animals, artificial systems, etc. So this identity is not supposed to be a metaphysical identity. The physical properties are merely postulated, even though they are to a certain extent real, because they map some essential properties of consciousness. Okay, so I'm kind of running out of time, so I will just very quickly claim that all this talk of cause-effect powers in IIT, I think, justifies the claim that IIT departs from categoricalism, which is the view that phenomenal properties, that there are some properties in the first place that are not essentially characterized by their dispositional or causal profile, and that instead IIT is compatible with an alternative view, which is very present in the metaphysical debate of the past 20 years, which I label pandispositionalism, which is the view that all properties are powers, meaning they have their dispositional character essentially. But of course, with a little twist, in the sense that for IIT, this power is intrinsic cause-effect power, which is a pretty well-defined kind of power. So the situation is that resilient monism makes a distinction between phenomenal categorical properties and physical dispositions, and claim that phenomenal properties are non-dispositional. Whereas, like for IIT, every property is at least can be translated into, can be described as cause-effect power. Okay, so in what remains, I will quickly try to see how IIT fares in comparison to the two scenarios that I described above. For the absent qualia scenario, we can ask again, can we duplicate physical properties without duplicating phenomenal properties? Well, in IIT's view, the physical properties, as we said, are actually postulated from within experience. And of course, we could be wrong about precisely which postulate we came up with. We can be wrong about what cause-effect power we are trying to map to experience. But if IIT is correct, one formulation of one version of IIT, maybe IIT 37.6, will be maybe closer to the truth, and it will actually show that cause effect structures can be put in this one-to-one correspondence with experience. So the idea is that if, starting from phenomenology, we infer that some cause effect power corresponds to phenomenal experience, then duplicating that cause effect power, we can always check if these cause effect powers are the same. They compose into the same cause effect structure. And the inference for Iit is that we could actually infer from the correspondence one-to-one that whenever we find in a different system a similar cause effect structure, then we can, based on all the Iit's methodology and metaphysics, we can justify the inference that the experience that will correspond to those cause effect powers and ultimately physical states will be of the same sort. So there will be no cause effect structure that is instantiated in the absence of experience. The objection that can be raised to Iit, of course, is that if Iit is true, then cause effect power cannot be instantiated without phenomenal properties, but it is also conceivable that it could, so Iit must be false, and this is, of course, follows from the conceivability argument. And let's just notice that precisely the same argument can be raised against Russellian monism. So if Russellian monism is true, physical dispositions cannot be instantiated without phenomenal properties, but it is conceivable that they could, so Russellian monism must be false. Well, both these theories basically claim that conceivability is not a good guide to possibility, but in particular, Iit replies that physical dispositions are, based on a central identity, necessarily connected to phenomenal experience. And one additional question is, how precisely do we explain the content of experience based on the cause effect structure? However, this is a better situation than the situation in which Russellian monism is, which is that even knowing all the facts about the physical properties should lead us to understand that there can't be an instantiation of physical properties without an instantiation of phenomenal properties. However, first of all, we have no way to know precisely because phenomenal properties are intrinsic and categorical, and the connection between the phenomenal and the physical properties is just a guess. There's no way to actually test it. And second of all, because we don't have an explanation of the content of experience and also a mapping between physical properties and phenomenal properties, as from the inverted Qualia scenario we discussed before. So, let me just skip this slide, which is a little bit technical, and it just claims that in order to see how Iit fares with respect to the conceivability argument and its explanation of the content of experience, it seems crucial that it should be possible to infer properties of experience from properties of physical state, or in Iit's case, cause effect structures. And this follows because the fact that the conceivability argument holds relies precisely on the failure of epistemic entailment between physical properties and phenomenal properties. But let's just leave it there. If you want to talk about this, we can talk about it in question time. What is important is just to try to see how Iit is able to explain the content of experience and to justify the grounding of an inference between phenomenal properties and cause effect structures, and vice versa, the other way around, from cause effect structure to phenomenal properties. So, just to give a quick example, let's imagine the case of an experience that we all know very well, which is drinking wine, especially Italians. Here, there's a lot of Italians, and they're very expert on this. So we can imagine the distinction between an uneducated drinker who is blindfolded and for the first time tries red and white wine, and he could arguably maybe just be able to distinguish the difference between a red wine and a white wine, or maybe a bunch of red wines and a bunch of white wines, but without really distinguishing between fine grained distinct red wines. But let's imagine that this person also goes through training, he becomes a sommelier, and he becomes an expert on wine tasting. So it starts realizing that actually among all the red wines, there are very different kinds. You can have, of course, an experience of a red wine that is of the taste of Nebbiolo, which will be related to a Qualia of a red wine, which is also Nebbiolo, but also you could distinguish this Qualia from the experience of another kind of red wine, which could be a Beaujolais. But on top of that, among all the different Beaujolais, you could start being able to recognize a specific kind of Beaujolais, let's say a Chenin. And at the end of the training, to get your diploma, you will actually start being able to distinguish between different vintages of a specific wine, for example, a 2014 and a 2016 vintage. So what is the description of Brazilian monism of this situation? Well, if phenomenal experiences have no essential dispositional character, a phenomenal experience such as the experience of a red wine has its phenomenal character to a certain extent independently of the physical goings on in the brain. And it shouldn't also be particularly affected, or there should be no reason why it is affected. It should be contingent that it is affected by acquired discriminative capacities. So to a certain extent, even after becoming a sommelier, the person should be able to still experience that qualia of general sort of platonic hyperuranic red wine that was experienced before the training. And this is precisely because experiences in Brazilian monism are intrinsic. They are not dependent on the dispositional character, the distinctions that one can make. The situation for Iits is quite different. In terms of cause-effect structures, we could imagine, very simplistically, of course, that in the cause-effect structure of the uneducated drinker, there will be only two concepts, maybe, and one relation about wine, and they will be white wine against red wine. And these two experiences will be related to these two concepts. However, undergoing a training, the cause-effect structure of a sommelier would become very, very wide and rich. And if it is true that there is a correspondence one-to-one between cause-effect structures and phenomenal properties, the phenomenal properties will also change with learning, and they will co-vary with the acquired discriminative capacity. So it is very important that in IIT, the dispositional profile of each cause-effect repertoire that corresponds to an experience is related to all the different cause-effect repertoire, all the different concepts in a cause-effect structure, meaning the experience of each individual qualia will change based on the dispositions and how they change in the cause-effect powers of the system. So the idea is that for IIT, each concept, I will skip the quotation, each concept relates to the rest of the cause-effect structure, and this brings the conclusion that a similarity between phenomenal experiences should correspond to similarity among concepts. So if we ask the question, can we simply switch qualitative content, qualia, without switching dispositions? Well, IIT replies, no, we can't, because if we want to maintain this correspondence, and if it is true that this correspondence holds, then phenomenal properties and concepts will have to be tightly related. And they will also, so phenomenal experiences will also be directly translated into cause-effect powers in a system, so that the metaphysical relation between the two will be maintained. So I will finish in 2 minutes, if I still have this time, with two examples that are very provisional, just to give you an idea of what are the directions in which Iits is actually trying to do research about these issues. And this is the sort of more scientific part of Iits. So a first theoretical attempt to show that there can be a correspondence between phenomenal experience and physical states, or even better, cause-effect structure that is specified by a physical system, is the use of category theory by Tsuchiya and other colleagues. So category theory, for the ones who never heard of it, is a mathematical approach, and the objective is to find a functor between different categories, where functors are simply some structure-preserving mappings, and categories are the most abstract sort of mathematical object you can imagine. They are labeled directed graphs with objects as nodes and arrows as edges. So it is a very, very abstract mathematical approach. But the interesting thing is that the proponents of this approach said something like this: we should test if there exists a functor that preserves the structure of both qualia and the cause-effect structures. Once this is achieved, we can analyze the mathematical structures of a system whose qualia are unknown, so for example babies, bats, insects, plants, and what have you, and translate it into the qualia domain. So this is the procedure that we propose to solve extremely difficult questions in the qualia domain. The idea is to use this sort of mappings to infer properties of experience from properties of cause-effect structures. A second and last attempt that has been carried on for the past 4 years, and it's actually forthcoming in a paper probably in the next few months, is to, it's more experimental, even though experimental is a big word here, because the idea is that we know that some particular pieces of neural cortex are associated with specific experiences. So for example, visual cortex is associated with visual experience. So sensory modalities are well located in the brain, at least for what we know. And the idea is that modeling of these some pieces of cortical areas with a specific grid-like structure, meaning topographically organized lateral connections among units, for example, visual cortex, so taking little pieces of visual cortex and studying the architecture of these networks, can show that two-dimensional grids with the appropriate connections that, of course, are neurophysiologically accurate, in terms of Iits, specify a cause-effect structure that would match some key topological properties of the experience of visual space. And in this picture, you can see on the bottom, you can see a little network of 8 neurons, which are connected with lateral connections and self-loops. And I will not comment on the details, but with Iits tools, we can sort of unfold, so study the cause-effect structure that is specified by this little network, and study the number of concepts and how they relate to each other. And the attempt is to show that, for example, the visual space, the sort of two-dimensional canvas that we have in front of our eyes, has some topological properties that are reflected in the cause-effect structure. And so we could, based on the cause-effect structure of parts of the visual cortex that we can alter and perturb and even maybe study when they are impaired, we could actually infer back what would be the corresponding effect on the experience. And this is, of course, an interesting tool and a proof of concept that Iits can tell us something about the content of experience based on cause-effect structures. All right, so to conclude, I tried to address the question, how do Iits and resilient monism score to respect to the absent and inverted qualia scenarios? I claim that resilient monism excludes absent qualia scenarios, but not inverted qualia due to its commitment to categoricalism, whereas Iits excludes both, due to both its metaphysical foundations and also, I claim, its commitment to pandispositionalism. So now, how do they account for the content of experience? Well, resilient monism seems to claim that there can be actually no inference between physical properties and phenomenal properties, or even in the opposite direction. It is silent on the content of experience and on the metaphysical relationship between specific phenomena. The only thing that it says is that if there are physical properties instantiated, there will be some phenomenal properties because they are grounded in them. That's the whole story. Whereas Iits seems to be well equipped in trying to go a little bit deeper. Of course, it's in its infancy and there's only hope for now, but the idea is that the axioms and the postulates provide us with a potentially fruitful account of the net relationship between phenomenal properties and properties of cause-effect structures. Then this inferential circle from experience to cause-effect structures and back suggests the possibility of actually inferring properties of experience from properties of cause-effect structures. And there is, of course, an attempt, besides some philosophical work to build the philosophical foundations of Iits and make them more rigorous. There is also some theoretical and experimental work, for example, in category theory, visual space, but these are only two projects among many others. And these can offer maybe an opportunity to actually test Iits predictions and potentially also invalidate and falsify the theory. Thank you.